This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. This episode is sponsored by C-School, the online school for creativity training. If you'd like to unleash your creative potential and access a free Creativity Blueprint training series, then just head over to c.school. That's www.c.school for your free training series. In today's episode, I speak with Dorie Clark, and we talk about doing original research, finding your optimal time to create, and the power of networking. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dorie Clark. Dorie Clark is an adjunct professor at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business and the author of Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of 2015 by Inc. magazine. A former presidential campaign spokeswoman, the New York Times described her as having an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. A frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, she consults and speaks for clients including Google, Microsoft, and the World Bank. And it's my great pleasure to have Dorie join us today. So welcome, Dorie.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
So share with everyone what's going on in your world just now.
Oh, my goodness. Well, probably the biggest thing going on in my world doesn't necessarily even have to do with business, although you could call it the fruit of the labor, which is that I just a couple days ago signed a contract to buy a new condo. So I'm going to be getting a new place here in New York City, which is very exciting.
And so I know you're a speaker, so you're traveling around all the place all the time as well. Do you enjoy your time on the road? Are you a bit more of a kind of a homebody, preferring to kind of stay closer to New York?
Well, I like speaking for sure. It's a fun part of my business, and one of the things kind of on a pound for pound basis is the most fun for me. But it is true that the travel gets exhausting. So I've tried to make smarter decisions, you could say, about it in recent years in terms of what gigs to accept and how to structure it in my life. In 2015, the year my book Stand Out came out, I gave 74 talks, and I just realized that was way too many. Yeah. That sort of averages out to at least one, often two per week. So I've cut back from there to what I feel like is a little bit more sustainable of a pace.
And where did it all start for you? How did you get started? And obviously, we know you today as a speaker, but also as a very kind of great writer, prolific writer, kind of best-selling writer. Where did the writing part of you begin? At what point in your life did you say, actually, this is kind of what I want to do? Well,
I always liked writing from the time I was a kid, doing stories for the literary magazine or what have you. But my first job, actually, after I finished graduate school, was being a newspaper reporter. And I was working in Boston. I was covering local politics. And I assumed that I would just build a career steadily in the newspaper industry. It turned out that was kind of interrupted because the newspaper industry, around the time that I was first entering it, which was 2000, started, unfortunately, a couple of decades of just steep downward decline. And so I ended up being among the first casualties of that and got laid off after only a year in the job. And it was, at that time, it was the post 9/11 recession in the US, and no one was hiring. And I just couldn't get another job as a journalist. And of course, over the ensuing years, the ranks were dramatically thinned. So that prompted me to have to reinvent myself and reinvent my business. But that training, that year really that I just spent as a professional journalist, it turned out to be invaluable for me in my books and the later blogging that I did and things like that, in learning how to write quickly, how to write to deadline, and to just not be so precious about it in the way that I think a lot of people are. Many people assume that writing has to really be perfect, and I think that paralyzes them. And when you're a journalist, there really is no such thing as writer's block. If you pretend there's writer's block, I mean, you get fired. So you learn pretty quickly there's no writer's block.
So do things become easier as you go? I mean, you've got 3 books. We've mentioned Can Stand Out, Reinventing You, and Entrepreneurial You. By the time you got to that third one, were things easier, or do you feel that you just have to you continue kind of pushing yourself and achieving new heights?
I think in terms of the writing process, it was pretty similar. I've never found writing to be painful. I think that if you have the right systems in place, it can be pretty easy and pretty fun. For a lot of people, I think they imagine that in order to write a book, they're going to have to take time off work. They're going to have to curtail their other business activities. I don't think that's true. I was not in a position to afford to be able to do that. I had to keep up my other business interests, but I was able to integrate it into the work that I did. And in all cases, for all 3 of my books, I wrote a first draft, I think, reasonably high quality first draft within about 2 or 2.5 months of steady work. I think that's very doable for most people. What did get different, and I think better, is that we all have kind of our quirks in writing, largely as a result of the training we've had. So, academicians, for instance, need to kind of learn how to write in a less complex or more accessible way. A quirk that I had through my training as a journalist was not about accessibility, because I think journalists generally prize that, but it was that the mantra that when you are the journalist, you are not the story. You are the observer, and the story is something else. And what I came to realize is that in terms of the business books that I write, people actually really do like to hear about you and your experiences. It gives it a little more authenticity. It makes it more relatable, and I think just more enjoyable for the reader. And so over time, I've had to learn how to bring more of myself into the story, and so have progressively done that.
Yeah, there's that danger. And I remember when I first were kind of going out speaking, that I was really using other stories, other people's stories, other things out there. And one of my speaking coaches at the time said it's all very well and everything, but you're sounding a bit like a cover band. You should be creating your own things, your own ideas, and kind of putting them out there rather than just kind of regurgitating other people's ideas and putting it together in a slightly different way.
That's a great analogy.
Where do you go for, whether you're writing on your books or your keynotes, those new ideas? Where do you go for inspiration?
Well, I think that what sort of separates the work of original thinkers, and I mean, the good news is that this is not that hard, right? It's just a question of people doing it. So if you make the effort, I think it really can pay dramatic dividends. But I think what makes the difference is actually being willing to do some original research. For a lot of people, those starting out, but I would argue a lot of people who have even been in the field for a long time, they are getting their examples, as you were saying, a little bit regurgitated. They read Dan Pink's book, they read Chip Heath's book. Oh, okay, let's just tell the story from there. Or maybe, they read this in the New York Times, so they just kind of mash it together. And as a result, it does all start to sound the same. But if you can do a little bit of original research in terms of interviewing people on your own and finding your own unique examples, you begin to become the pace setter. Now, how do you find the examples? Honestly, in a lot of cases, it's just digging the interesting parts out of people you already know. For my book, Reinventing You, literally almost all the people were people that I just knew in my daily life in Boston. I didn't have a lot of fancy connections or anything like that, but I have always been pretty curious about people. And so I would find out things about people's history that I thought was interesting. And I would just kind of file it away in my brain and say, this is a good example of that. And when the time came, I would just interview them about it and get that perspective and draw it out. And I think it was able to create a pretty richly textured picture about the reinvention process. But it wasn't, this crazy, let's search for the Holy Grail. It was just looking around at people already in my existing networks and finding what was interesting and special about them. I think anyone can do that.
What were some of the skills that you were able then to bring from that journalism background into that process of interviewing those as potential case studies in your books? Were there certain ways that you asked questions or certain things you were very keen to ensure that you kind of pulled out of those interviews?
Well, I think that the most important thing is forcing people to be specific. This is a place where if you have somebody that is a good instinctive interviewee, they can help you and you can get lucky. But for a lot of people, especially if they're not used to being interviewed, they will tell their story in a kind of general 30,000 foot sense. So they'll say, oh, well, I used to be doing this and then I decided I needed to do something different. So I switched. Oh, okay. Well, that's not helpful at all. You need, if they're not offering it, you need to really drill down, force them into the specifics. Okay, wait a minute. When was the first moment you realized you needed to switch careers? What made you think that? How did the people around you react? How did you feel at the time? Were you scared? How did you know what you wanted to switch to? Did it turn out to be easier than you thought, harder than you thought? You have to really bring them back into the moment, because if left to their own devices, not everybody, but a lot of people will tell basically very shitty stories, and you have to force them. But once you force them, the stories are actually kind of amazing. And so a good reporter will get it out of them.
Were there any ones that you went to in that kind of interviewing, kind of going and finding that kind of primary research for the books that were like that? It was an example of that, or of it kind of started, yeah, okay, this is like, this is not maybe getting this stuff. And then suddenly something happened. And it was just an absolute gem that was hidden underneath of all this, and you were able to then use in the book.
Yeah, for the interviews that I did for Reinventing You in particular, I did have an advantage in that I already knew enough, because these folks were typically in my social circle or maybe just 1 or 2 degrees removed from it, that I already knew I was interviewing them for a reason. They had switched from X career to Y career. And I already thought, all right, if they did that, there's got to be something there. So fortunately, I was in a position where it wasn't just kind of blind prospecting. I knew there had to be a story there. It was just a question of getting them to articulate that. So I can't necessarily point to one moment of breakthrough, but I had faith. And I actually have faith in general, in terms of the general population, that for almost anybody, just in living a life, there are very interesting pieces if you know what questions to ask, and if you can really prompt people to get back into the moment and to embody their reactions rather than just kind of glossing things over. And
you mentioned your writing was happening at just trying to squeeze the writing in, especially in those early days, between other things, the other work you had on. When were you doing it? Were you end up getting up a few hours early? Were you burning the midnight oil? Were you just taking supposed holiday time and actually just kind of going deep and writing? Where did you manage to squeeze that time?
Yeah, so I was in the fortunate position of working for myself. So I at least, I was putting in the same total amount of work, but I did have the ability to shift my schedule freely so that I could write at the time that was optimal for me, which I do think is an advantage. More and more attention has been paid to people's circadian rhythms and when they are most optimal. Dan Pink wrote about this in his book When. Tony Schwartz has been talking about, the sort of mantra of manage your energy, not your time, et cetera. And so there's times when personalized times when people are just sort of at their peak productivity. And if you want to be really smart about it, you want to be doing your creative work, like writing, at the time when you are in the best state. If you're trying to do it at the end of a long day and you're just feeling totally worn out, you might be working for 4 hours, but you're probably only getting an hour's worth of work actually done because you're just not fully present.
As you kind of went through that, was that something that you kind of got to learn after, quite a long period of time, finding that when you were at your kind of creative peak in the day, or did you have a sense of that pretty early on in your life?
I think that most people probably have a pretty good sense of whether they're, an early bird or a night owl or what have you. there's a kind of rule of thumb. Dan Ariely, the author of Predictably Irrational, has talked about this, where for most people, not everyone, but for most people, your peak ability to do creative work and work effectively comes about 2 hours after you first wake up. So, let's pretend if you wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning, probably 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock, that sort of, it starts 2 hours after you wake up and goes until the fourth hour. Those 2 hours are kind of magic. And so you should be, even if you're an office worker and you don't have total control over your schedule, you probably have a little control. You probably have some discretion about when you might be able to schedule certain meetings or calls or whatnot. And so if you can shift it around so that you're doing your most important work during that time slot, that is very useful. However, of course, if you know that you're a natural night owl and that you get better and better as the day goes on, then you would want to probably have the opposite schedule. But yeah, for me, it's just it's just sort of an easy gut check. It's like, when is my head the clearest? When am I the least distractible? When am I the least likely to be like, I don't really want to work, where's Facebook? That kind of thing.
Yeah. So talk about night owls. One of the things I noticed on your bio was that you have been a producer on a multiple Grammy award-winning jazz album. So I'm thinking, first of all, I want to know that story, how that came about. But also I was thinking, for jazz albums, one of those ones I always find interesting in that most jazz musicians tend to be kind of later people in terms of, because they're playing in clubs, they're doing concerts and things, and yet the albums always have to be recorded during the day. And I always think that's a strange kind of like, why did they record albums at night?
It's such a good point. I think you're exactly right, James. If you really wanted to hack the system, that's probably a much better way of doing it. I think that it's probably the same reason as the reason that school takes place when it does, which is that we like to pretend that school is for the benefit of the kids, but it's not. Because if it were, it would be set according to kids' circadian rhythms, which every study in the world has shown are much later than adults. If you're a high schooler, for instance, almost no high schooler is naturally going to get up willingly at 7 o'clock in the morning. That is not how they roll. Their circadian rhythms are set much later, and studies have shown that that you can get much better test scores and much better learning results if school starts, later, 9 o'clock, say. But we don't do that. We schedule school for the convenience of parents who are dropping people off and teachers who actually do like to get up early. So similarly, we'd probably like to say, oh yeah, we want the best jazz product, but honestly, it's probably a question of like, oh, when can we get an engineer, and do we have to pay them overtime?
So what's the story of that album? I mean, how did you end up as a producer on a multiple Grammy award-winning album?
So this is pretty much entirely a story about networking, which I think is kind of fun and hopefully useful for people listening to a business podcast. Networking really can take you to some amazing and powerful places. I have a friend named Kabir Siegel, who is a guy that I met through author circles. He's a very, very much a Renaissance man. But one of the things that he's done is he's written a book, kind of a business book called Coined, which is a history of money. And I got to know him through that, and we became friendly. And I had an inspiration that I needed to connect him because he was very involved in the jazz world, had written a book also about jazz, had produced some jazz albums, etc. I had an inspiration that I needed to connect him to another friend of mine who was a jazz musician. And so I did. And it turns out they hit it off and they ended up collaborating on a project together. And so it was like a good match, a really good match. And as a result of that, Kabir, basically as a thank you, was working on this other project, Presidential Suites by the Ted Nash Big Band, for which he was the executive producer. And he, as a favor, just said, hey, I'm working on this project. I think it really has legs. I think it could really go somewhere. Would you be interested in coming on as a producer for it? And so, of course, I'm like, okay, sure, Kabir. And then it turns out Kabir was right. It ended up getting nominated for 2 Grammys and winning 2 Grammys.
So what a strange world we live in. Funny enough, I was just talking with David Burkus, who has a book that's just coming out just now, all about networks and what we're learning in terms of network science, about how the power of networks. And one of the interesting things that he spoke about on that was, we think about, okay, there's all those expressions, you are the average of the 5 people you know best, and things like that. He said, but actually what network science has shown us is it's actually the friends of your friends where the real power works. And he's spoken about some really fascinating studies there in terms of how you are more likely to be obese if your friends of your friends are obese, because it comes back the other way. And so what you just described there is a little bit of the kind of the network science in action.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love David, and actually was one of the people doing a blurb for his book. So I definitely want to give a shout out for friend of a friend. I think that it really does, kind of go back to these foundational principles. I mean, one of the most famous studies that had been done years ago about network science was the Mark Granovetter study that showed when people said, well, how did you find your job? And at first people would say, oh, well, I got it through a friend. And so for a long time, people said, oh, well, it must be that, friends are really important for networking. Okay, great. But it turns out that Mark Granovetter, who's a well-known sociologist, did a little bit of extra digging. And what he discovered was, it's not quite right. They didn't actually hear about the jobs from friends. They heard about them from acquaintances. And so meaning that the sort of further out connections were actually the more valuable, because those were the ones that were more likely to traffic in circles that you didn't touch and to have access to information that you never even came close to. And so I think that that Kabir and producing this album and things like that really is kind of good evidence of that, in that I don't have a lot to do with the jazz world. That was not my world at all. But because of the fact that I am a big believer in broad stroke networking, I'm a believer in bridging ties, quote unquote, where you're reaching out to different kinds of people. It was enough to kind of get me into a space that I otherwise never would have been.
And a lot of studies have shown, we had Dr. K.H. Kim on here recently, talking about how a study she did on Nobel Prize winners, saying that most of the top Nobel Prize winners are boundary crossers. they have their main domain that they're known for and they have expertise in, but then they'll go and learn about another domain and then apply it to that. And just because they're able to hop, see those ties between those things that no one else can see, it gives them a little bit of an unfair advantage.
Yes, absolutely.
So as you were going through, that's obviously an example. That Grammy Award-winning album is a good example of a project that worked. Is there an example of a project, something you worked on, you gave it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason, it didn't work out like you'd hoped? And more importantly, what were the lessons that you took from that experience?
Yeah, sure. There's certainly, plenty of examples of things like that. I remember, for instance, some of these things I tried a while ago, and it was just me not really understanding how the system worked or what would be effective. And so it's really motivated me in a lot of ways with the books that I've written to try as best I can to crack the code of getting better known, building a business, etc. Stand Out is fundamentally a book about how do you build your brand, how do you build your professional reputation. And Entrepreneurial You is a book about how do you actually build your business? How do you create multiple income streams? How do you build passive income? Because I came to discover that a lot of people just don't necessarily talk about these things, whether it's that they don't want to look like they're bragging, or in some cases they don't really know, or they feel like maybe it's gauche to be talking about the mechanics of how the system works, because we like to have this myth that just talent rises to the top, which of course is a very nice and self-congratulatory myth if you are already at the top. But it's extraordinarily frustrating and unhelpful for people that are trying to get known and get noticed in the first place. And so, I think about one example of something that I tried and thought of. when I was kind of in the early days of my business, I had heard that it was a good idea to have DVDs of yourself, like giving speeches or something like that. And so I figured, okay, some of them I can give out to conference organizers so that it's a way for them to see what my speaking skills are like. And maybe I can sell a few, and that would be a way for me to sort of take care of the cost of having the DVD produced and filmed. So, I had this sort of elaborate thing, but back then I didn't really have a lot of talks that I was giving in the first place. So I had to kind of gin up a talk to have filmed. So I did it at a local college and spoke to, like some entrepreneurship club or something like that. And it was just like, it like so many things went wrong in different ways. The first one was that even from the filming, I hired a videographer, and the footage looked good, but the problem, this was just like not, I wasn't thinking of this, and the videographer clearly was not either, although I sort of wished she had, because it was sort of her job. But the students had set up this, like some snacks, because it was like, oh, it's the entrepreneurship club, right? So they have snacks. And so in every shot she took, it was a picture of me and the snack table. And so it's like, how professional is this? It's like, oh, this, Dorie giving this really exciting talk in front of a snack table. It was like so humiliating. I spent $1,000 creating it. So meanwhile, nobody bought copies of the videos, and I gave them away. But then before long, people stopped having DVDs anyway, and everything was up on YouTube. So it's just this like colossally unhelpful waste of money, where early on I wasn't sure what to spend money on, and so I kind of chose the wrong thing.
And essentially, I was watching earlier your videos. I think you gave one to Google, the Google HQ as well, and that was great because it's not like a flash type of video, but it just gets to see you in action. It sees you, great speaker, and the content is really, really solid there as well. And I think we're kind of going through it used to be like, maybe in the 90s, the kind of style for the very, someone with a voiceover, in a deep voiceover doing these speaker reels. I think things have changed now. And you have a wonderful TED Talk video as well, which is like almost like one of the best type of speaker videos you can have.
Thank you. Yes. Those are much better videos, and not a snack table in sight.
Exactly. Is there an online resource or a tool or a mobile app you find really useful for yourself now as a writer and as a speaker?
Well, certainly from the speaking perspective, one that I end up using a lot is called TripIt Pro. TripIt, they have a free version. I actually use the paid one, which is not that expensive. It's like $50 a year. But when you are traveling a lot for business, it is really helpful. It enables you to capture all of your travel information in one place. So all you need to do is forward your confirmation of your flight, your rental car, your hotel, etc., to the TripIt address, and it will automatically group it together for you. And so once you get to the destination, instead of having to root around and say, oh, which hotel was it? Which rental car was it? And you're looking for the confirmation number, all the information is in one place. And also, if you have the paid service, they will notify you in advance about flight delays and things like that, so that you can be really on top of it and sort of ahead of the curve in dealing with it. So I've found it to be very valuable, because everybody knows if you're spending time on the road, inevitably there's going to be some things that go wrong. So the more you can ease that burden, the better.
And what about if you were to recommend just one book to our listeners, not necessarily one of your books, but a book maybe that's really inspired you, or a book you maybe think should be getting read by more people? What would that book be? And also one record, one album that you'd recommend. What would those be?
Wow. Okay. Well, so for the book, I will suggest one. It's a very good read. It's well written, interesting. It is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. And he's a strategy professor at, I believe, UCLA. And it's just a very interesting book about corporate strategy, but I think the lessons are very applicable for almost everybody about how do you make good decisions in your life and make sure that you are looking at the right criteria so you don't get turned around or misled. And if we're looking for an album, I would say that, gosh, I can tell you what I've been listening to a lot lately is I'm a huge 80s fan, and so I've been listening to Chicago Greatest Hits. I'm not so much with Chicago lasted a long time, and I was not so much into their like stuff from the 70s. But if we're talking like Peter Cetera era of like all the sort of 80s chart toppers, I think those are fantastic.
What a good driving music there as well.
Yeah.
What about? Can you tell us about like a key aha moment or light bulb moment in your career, time when you went, oh, okay, this is the direction I want to be going with my work, or you made a very important distinction which has influenced the work that you do today?
Well, one that really stands out, James, is I, for a long time, had wanted to write a book. That was just, sort of a general goal that I had for myself. And so in 2009, I wrote 3 different book proposals because I was just so committed to getting a book done. I'm like, one of these is going to work. I'm just going to keep writing proposals until somebody bites. And I just kept at it and kept at it. And nobody wanted any of them. It was just like, no. And it was really frustrating. And what I finally heard and learned from them was that I was just not of interest because I was not yet famous enough. I did not have a sufficient brand such that publishers would be interested in working with me. And so I needed to start blogging. And I ended up essentially through an accident blogging for the Harvard Business Review. It turned out that I lived in Boston, and I sold my bicycle on Craigslist to a woman who worked at the Harvard Business Review.
We're hearing this is another one of those networks effects coming in now.
Exactly. So it was luck and preparation because I was very prepared to do some pitching, once I made this connection. But I started blogging for HBR, and I wrote a blog post called How to Reinvent Your Personal Brand. And that one became popular. And so they reached out to me and asked, hey, would you expand this into being a magazine article? And so I did that. And literally the week that it came out in the Harvard Business Review, 3 different literary agents reached out to me and said, hey, have you thought about turning this into a book? Now, I had spent the entire previous year and a half trying to get a book published, and no one cared at all. And now all of a sudden I had multiple literary agents coming to me, which was crazy. And so finally I was like, oh, this is what it feels like to be wanted. This is the sign. And so I was like, I had not in fact considered turning that into a book, but as soon as they reached out, I'm like, hell yes, I will turn this into a book. And that became Reinventing You.
And I want you to finally imagine that you woke up tomorrow morning. I'm going to let you choose any city in the world. You can be in Boston, wherever you'd like to be, but you have to start from scratch. So you have all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. What would you do? How would you restart?
Yeah. So if we're talking about how to restart, I would say that one of the things that I did early on that I didn't really think of it necessarily at the time as a comprehensive networking strategy, although it was, and it was a good one, so I would suggest it to others, is to interview people. And the reason that I think that this is a very good strategy is that number one, you can reach out to people, and if you are asking for an interview, it is a much more giving way to connect to them rather than just like, hey, can I have coffee? Can I pick your brain? Because you are essentially, it accomplishes the same thing, but you're also giving them a platform to reach other people. So it's received much more differently, much better. And nowadays, anyone can start a blog, anyone can start a podcast. So even if you're not like, an official journalist or something, you can still interview people. And so it's a very good way to rapidly make connections, essentially do favors for people, because you're doing something nice by helping them spread the word. And a certain percentage of those people you might be able to form a relationship with, and they can suggest other people for you to meet. And it allows you to build a network rather rapidly.
Wonderful suggestion there as well. If people want to reach out to you, maybe someone listening just now has a podcast, they have a blog, and they want to reach out to you and feature you in what they're doing, or they maybe want to bring you in to come and speak at their next event. What's the best place for them to go and do that?
Yeah, thank you so much, James. The best place to get me is on my website. It's dorieclark.com. It's DORIECLARK.com. I have more than 400 free articles there that I've written for places like Forbes and the Harvard Business Review, many of them interviews, in fact. And if people are interested, I also have a free resource, which is the 88-question Entrepreneurial You self-assessment for people who are interested in thinking about creating multiple income streams in their business. And anyone can get that for free, again, at my website, dorieclark.com.
Wonderful. We're going to have all the links for that as well. Dorie, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you as well, and I wish you all the best with your next book. I'm sure that you may already be writing it as we speak.
Thank you so much, James.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.